In this video, we're gonna tackle the remaining part of this menu here in the bottom. The first thing I'm gonna show you in this video is gonna be this collection option here. So let's click that and let's talk about it. So I think I told you already that Boxcutter by default is going to create a cutter collection the first time you're gonna cut something. So if I'm gonna grab a cube, if you look here in the scene collection, if I draw a cut, there you go. So it will create a cutters collection and this is going to be assigned automatically here. So when you're gonna be using Everscroll with hard ups, you can just recall all the cutters. So Shift 2 to turn it on and off, right? Now this one here is different. This is custom cutters that you can actually scroll through. So let me show you. You need to first create them. So let's just grab two planes, right? There we go. I'm going to just, cut them somehow. Just doesn't matter what it is, just some random cuts. Alt X with hard ups to mirror and then Q and operations multiply. So it's a mesh. And this one too, just cut it, whichever way, doesn't matter. And then Alt X and, we PG, right? So operations multiply. So we got two different cutters, profiles, right? So let's grab them and let's press M, new collection, and you can call it whatever you want. I'll call it recall and create. Now we can turn it off. So let me just nuke this, grab a new cube. Now if you go to D menu, you can assign it to this collection. So click here and assign recall to recall. And then what you can do, you can recall them. And there are two ways you can do this, right? One of them is going to be by running simply a cut, holding Alt and scrolling up or down. Now, another way is going to be drawing a cut, pressing Tab to pause it, pressing D for box helper menu. And this one is a little bit different. So you see similar options, the same name, but few things are different. So here you can actually change or choose the cutter you want. So that's where you flip through them. You can here, rotate it inside, right? You can just rotate it around and you have rotation angles here, all kinds of different settings, dimensions, etc. Okay. So that's how this recall works, right? So then you apply it and you're good to go. So you can have as many cutters here as you want. And this one, supposedly, it should adjust the draw size of the cutter. So when you draw in a cutter, right, to the dimensions of the recalled cutter, but it doesn't work. Something is bugged over there, I think. So unless I'm missing something. But anyway, when you draw a cut, technically what it should do when you hold Alt and you recall this, it should adjust the size of it and dimensions to the cutter in question, but I don't think it does. Hang on, let me just try the depth. Let me just try this really shallow. Yeah, it doesn't. You see, it stays within the shape and the same depth. So I think it's just bugged. Let's try the other method. So let's press Tab D and let's try this way. It's the same thing. So either it's bugged or I'm missing something, but I think it's bugged because this should work. But anyway, you can use these custom cutters through recall, and this is just a default cutter section. Obviously you can assign different color to this folder here, but I would just stay with default. And that's all you need to know about this section. Just as additional tip here, I can tell you that when you draw in a cutter and you hold Alt, you can actually move your mouse up and down to adjust the height of the cutter. You can also do this by pressing E to offset, right? You can also press Tab and move these two faces with these dots. So you have options, but when you are actually using Alt, I think it's quicker because you hold Alt and you move your mouse up and down. And you can also obviously use it with a scroll to scroll through the shape. So Alt is pretty useful. So next, let's talk about the rotation angle. Well, it's really easy to understand when you're going to add a cube and you're going to be running a regular cut or whatever cut, and you're going to press R, you're going to be rotating according to or snapping to angles that were specified here. So for example, if I'm going to set it to 45 degrees, you're going to be snapping to 45 degrees. And if you hold Shift, you're going to release that lock. So remember, when you're using N-gon, you press Control to release the lock, right? Remember that? So you press D and you hold Control to release the lock, right? With rotation, however, you press Shift and hold Shift. So press R and then hold Shift and you can rotate, okay? Cool. Next one is going to be solver. Well, solver basically is the type of a boolean. So let's go here to booleans. Now you have two solvers here, fast and exact. By default, it's set to fast, and I suggest you stick to it because fast booleans take less memory and are less heavy and simply will not, make your viewport sluggish when you're running a lot of booleans. But exact booleans can be very useful when you're running tricky booleans, and sometimes booleans do not really perform very well. So let me just show you what I mean. Let me just grab this cube here and Shift D that, right? And press Shift Z. And you see this cube's gonna be Z fighting here, right? Let me just boolean this with hard up, so to Q and difference. And you see this solver here set to fast doesn't really perform very well, right? But if I switch it to exact, boom, this happens. So there's a different calculation for this boolean, and it simply goes through whenever the situation is a bit tricky and you get overlapping surfaces, etc. So just use that. So that's what this does, and you can activate this during the cut. So when I'm going to be cutting, right, you see here, you can press Alt-E to switch between different solvers. So that's the option. And this one simply dictates the default solver for all the booleans out of the gate. And I would just keep it to fast. Laser cut is an interesting one. So by default, when you run a cut on a mesh and you draw a cut and just click, it's going to go through the entire mesh. And if you recover the cutter with Everscroll, so Q and Everscroll, it's going to be more or less the exact length of this mesh. It's going to be slightly taller in order to, bypass any issues with the fast solver. Otherwise, it would be flush with the surface and you would need to be using exact solver. So this is what's going to happen with the laser cut set to 0. Now, if you're going to change it, for example, to 1 meter, and the cube is 2 meters, when you're going to run a cut here like this, so draw and click, it's going to go exactly 1 meter. So you can define the depth of your cuts if you want to. So this is quite useful. And if you click here, you're going to have some additional options, right? Now this option here is going to set the laser cut to auto depth. So when you're going to be drawing the cut, you're going to be cutting through the mesh at the same time. And it's going to be kind of set to a proportional size to the cutter, dimensions. And then here you can specify the depth multiplier. So let's say set it to 5 and keep it on this auto depth, and this is going to happen, right? It's going to be much longer, you see. So it's kind of a fiddly tool, more of like a gimmick, to be honest. I never use it really. However, this one is quite useful because you can set the exact depth of your cuts. Now this one is for custom cutters, so the custom cutter is gonna retain its proportions when you're cutting. Okay, so let's switch it off here and switch it to 0. By default, if it's set to 0, your cut's gonna go through the mesh. And this is, the behavior I prefer unless I'm performing some really specific cuts. And this one is also interesting. So let's grab a cube here and let's go to render view and let's go to materials and use our mats on this cube, right? And I'm gonna duplicate this cube and use a different mod here, so graphite steel. So now we got 2 mods in a scene, okay? Right? So watch this. Normally when I cut a mesh, it's going to cut it in and the mod inside of the mesh is going to be the same. Even though this is not not a real mesh, it's a boolean cut, so it's just a fake geometry because the boolean isn't applied. You can see the same mod, but you can change this here and you can select a different mod. So now you're going to be applying a mod to a cutter. So when you're cutting, you're going to be cutting with a different mod, right? You can't really see it here very well, but let me just try here on this side. Yeah. So you're cutting with this mod. Let me switch it to maybe something different, like maybe plastic white. Okay. So there you go. And let's just go to the menu and switch it to shiny plastic. Let me just select this cube and boom, see? So you're gonna be cutting with a different mud, which is really cool because if you think about it, this mesh, these faces here do not exist yet. It's all, you know, fakery because the booleans are not applied. And you can obviously, you know, reset this to 0. Now let's talk about this option. This one is really useful. So let's enable snapping. So you'll see that if you do that, you're gonna have additional menu here. And the same menu, by the way, is in here on the top. It's the same thing. So dots are extremely useful and I'm using them all the time. So when you enable this and hold Control, press Control and hold it, and move your mouse over your mesh, you will see that it's going to pinpoint middle of edges, middle of faces, and also verts. And you can change this behavior here. You can tell which kind of points you want to have highlighted. So let's say you got a really complicated mesh, right? Something like this. And it's going to be a complete disaster, right? So you may want to, for example, set it only to faces. So turn off these two, and then you're going to see only faces, right? So now let's just nuke this and grab a different cube. So the basic use of this would be to, for example, run circles or, you know, circular cuts in the middle of your face, which is really useful, right? So you can precisely determine where these cuts gonna be happening and it's dead on in the middle. So when you're gonna be, for example, mirroring this, let's say I'm gonna add a cut here on, you know, on this side. And let's say with this box like this, and I wanted to mirror this to the other side, right, like that. I know that my circle in the middle is going to be perfectly round after the mirror, because if it's slightly misaligned, right, you're going to get this kind of a situation. You see what I mean? So this is really important, and I'm using dots a lot when I'm modeling. They're fantastic for precision cuts. Okay, now let's go back here and just let's explore this menu. This one here, if you click that, you'll activate the grid. So when you hold Control and move your mouse, you see that you're gonna get this grid overlay. And now what you can do, you can start actually dragging and snapping into the grid with your cut. So you can run some really precise cuts on your mesh like this. And if you combine this, for example, with a laser cut or other tools, you can create very precise cuts in your mesh, perfectly aligned. So this tool is really fantastic. And obviously here you can change the size of the grid, and here you got some even more options. We're gonna be talking about them in a second. Now, when you're holding Control and you move your mouse, you see that you can go outside the face, but if you want to align it to this face here on the side, you need to release Control and press it again. If you enable this option, it will allow you to simply hold Control and move your mouse, and the grid's gonna snap automatically to these other faces. Now, normally when you're drawing on top of these dots, so let's say I have a square cut and I'm gonna hold Control and, you know, let's say draw a cut here like this, it's not going to snap to other dots. But if you're going to, let me just turn this off. But if you're going to go into this menu here and enable this option, so snap incremental, it will actually snap to increments, and you can obviously, you know, set them up. So now see here, you're gonna start snapping to increments. And again, you can use dots, right, and increments to create really precise cuts on your mesh. Like for example, something like this. And these settings here are the same as these. And if you turn it on, this log here is the same as this log, so it's the same function. Okay, it's a little bit confusing, I know. In fact, if you're gonna be using this tool, I would suggest using it here because it's a little bit less confusing, although it still might be a bit intimidating when you're gonna be using it for the first time, and honestly, it takes some time to get used to it. Now, these two is a static grid and static dots. So again, if you're gonna, for example, enable this grid either here or, you know, or in this area, it's the same thing, right? And you move your mouse and you hold Control, the grid is kind of dynamic, if you know what I mean. It just moves with your mouse. But this one is gonna be static. So if you enable this, the grid's gonna be static. You see, it's one sheet of a grid, and you can scroll your mouse in and out to make it smaller or bigger. So the grid is static, and then again you can just simply draw on the grid and cut through the mesh. And then you have also static dots. So let's just turn this off. So that means that, let me just turn off the grid here. So now when you hold control, you're going to highlight dots only on one face. You need to release control, press it again, and you can see dots on the other face. Move your mouse again, release control, press again, etc. So it's the same thing, just simply static, okay? That's, that's the difference here. And when you activate this, you're going to have additional options in here. So let me just nuke this, right? Because it's getting a bit complicated. And let me just show you. So dot to dot snap. Well, you're going to be snapping between dots like this, you see. So when you arrive at a dot, it's going to highlight it and you're going to snap. Now, if I'm going to run this cut down and press Alt E, I'm going to be enabling this exact solver, which will help me to deal with this kind of a overlapping situation in here. See that? So I just need a little bit of a notch here, to be honest, on the y-axis. There we go, and you got this kind of a cut. And this cut is happening precisely in the 1/4 of this cube. Now this next option, I think it's bugged actually, because it's supposed to show you a preview of the subdivision surface of the wireframe while you're drawing dots, but it doesn't work, so it could be bugged, not sure. Now this one here, I'll draw. It's actually the same as this option here, so instead of drawing from the corner, you're going to be drawing from the middle, but if you hold Alt again, you're going to switch, so it's just the same thing, I don't think this is useful. This one, although, is interesting. So, alignment preview. So if you're going to hold control and kind of hover over one of these dots, you will see the alignment preview of your cutter, right? So if I start drawing now, it's going to draw, in this direction. But if you scroll your mouse, you can actually tilt it and start drawing stuff like that. And if you're going to hold Alt in addition to this, so let me just scroll my mouse, right? Then start drawing and hold Alt, you can do stuff like that, which not many people know about. So if you combine all these tools and knowledge together, you can do some serious damage with this grid tool. And the last option here is going to be alignment preview. So you can make this larger or smaller. So let's say I'm going to set it to 10, right? So if I'm going to hover over now, it's going to be huge. If I'm going to make this smaller, let's say 3, as it's by default, it's going to be a bit smaller, that's all, right? So these are all the options that you need to know here from this static grid. And obviously you got rotation by angle here, and you can set different degrees if you want to. Now, speaking of rotation, I'm going to show you an Easter egg that probably no one knows about. So if you go into enable dots here and click on grid, and we're going to leave everything on default. So it's a dynamic grid and snapping to dots, right? And if I hold control, I'm going to get this dynamic grid here. So I'm going to start drawing from this dot here like that. And then I'm still holding the left mouse button, right? I release my control, then I press R, and then I start rotating. Now see, the rotation is happening around the middle of the shape. But if I press Control again, I'm going to start rotating around the initial entry point from which I started drawing the cut. So you could align your cut in an interesting way to your mesh. And by the way, you can change the angle here, the snapping angle of the rotation here. So if I set it to 45, for example, right, the rotation angle is going to be a little bit different. So it's 45 degrees. So if you're going to do that, you're going to be able to perfectly snap to 45 degrees here. So there you go. So just let's turn it off. And the last thing here in the bottom is going to be fading timing. So when you have these dots and you release control, they fade out. And so if you're going to press here and release, the dots are going to kind of fade away. And you can change the timing of the fading here. I never really touch it, to be honest. Not that important. So this would cover all these, snapping options here, different grids and dots. I'm not really using all these features, but let me tell you that this snapping tool or snap dots is really useful. So you might be finding yourself using that quite a lot. Now this tool here, I think it's bugged in this 4.4 and 4.3 version. So let me see. It's going to allow you to run a grid that you can cut with. So yeah, see, there's simply doesn't show the wireframe. So let me go to Blender 4.1 and I'm going to show you how this actually should look. And if I'm going to enable this, you're going to be able to draw kind of like a network of, of squares. You can obviously hold shift to make it a perfect square and then draw it down. And you can manipulate with this, for example, increase the solidification, create stuff like that. It could be interesting. There could be some use for it when you're creating, I don't know, some kind of superconductors or whatever. I've never used this even once, but there you go. It's there. And you can adjust the number of these, squares and cuts on each of these axes. Now, this one here, right, will disable the solidification of the border. So if I run this now, you can see that the border isn't solidified anymore. And this one, fill black, is when you're creating a shape on the floor. So when you create a shape like this, you see it's going to, let me just sharpen this, it's going to create these faces in between. It's going to create kind of like a grid-like structure, right? But if you don't have this turned on, right, it's just going to be a grid like that. So if you want to just draw it on the floor, you want to enable this, and then you're going to get this, right? Now this option, if you turn it off, it will not automatically solidify this grid. So it's going to be a little bit weird like that. I don't know if you want that. It's kind of weird. So I would just keep it on. Like I said, some of these tools are just gimmicks, not very useful, but maybe you're going to find use for this. But that's what this tool does. Now, next one is going to be wedge cut. If I enable this, by default, my cut is going to switch to wedge cut. You will see that line, which tells you which direction the wedge cut is going to go. You can press W to rotate it. You can also hold Control to run a perfect wedge cut. But you have different options with this tool here. So for instance, what you can do, you can change the relative scale of your wedge cut. So let's set it to 5, right? And just draw it, and you see this is what's gonna happen. So you're gonna get this kind of a stretching effect. Let me just rotate it, right? And move it somewhere here. This kind of a stretching effect going outside underneath the cut, right? Weird sort of a thing. But if you're gonna go lower, so let's say 0.5, things are getting more interesting. So let's just draw a cut here like that, and boom, you got this kind of a taper effect, which is really cool. Now this one, so when you enable this, right, the factor, right, it's a little bit different. The factor is going to determine the inner side of the wedge cut. So let's set it to, let's say 0, right? It's going to be sort of, you see, pushed backwards. So instead of falling forward, it's going to be falling backwards, which is really interesting, right? So it's going to be dipping towards this initial wall of the cut, right? On the other side of the outer face of this cube. Now, if you're gonna switch it to 0.5, it's gonna be sort of like, in the middle, right? Where you can create really interesting shapes like this, especially when you're gonna use Control, right? And then obviously 1 is a default. So, a regular wedge cut, right? So let me just rotate it. There you go. And boom, right? Normal wedge cut. And you switch off this laser cut, it's going to turn off this limit of the depth to which this wedge cut is going to be cutting. So now watch. Then if I'm going to run it through the mesh, like this, you see, it's going to taper all the way down to here, but it's going to go through the mesh. So there's no limitation, right? So you always want to have this on to kind of determine how deep this thing going to go, right? So these are the wedge cut settings. And by default, it's going to be 1 and I think 0.5, yes. So, kind of flat wedge cut here on sides. So 90 degrees, sloping down at a certain degree. And like I said, if you're going to hold Control, you can create a perfect wedge cut. So there you go. Now next one's gonna be this taper, and taper is gonna be like a one-time sort of a cut unless you switch this option on. So let's say 0.5, right? It's gonna be kind of like a in-between thing. So it's sort of you know, sloping at 45 degrees here on these, more or less on these you know, side edges. You see this is appearing, so you have to enable it again and again, unless you're gonna click on this option, which is going to set it to persistent taper. And at 0.1 it's gonna be really aggressive, right? Like that. And then at 1 is gonna be just simply a regular straight cut. So no taper. And let's just turn it off. And then here, if you enable this, right, here you can actually turn on the lattice. So each of these taper cuts of these booleans, right, so let's run a taper at 0.75 like this, right? If you're gonna recover the cutter, so Q and ever scroll, you see that's going to retain the lattice modifier used to create this this taper, and you can actually adjust it, yeah, like that. Now I don't really use this because when I want to use taper, I simply, let me just turn it off. Because when I want to use taper, I simply cut and then I press Shift T and I, you know, do that. Okay, so I don't really have to do this. This option doesn't really, you know, I don't really need that. And lastly, we have these. Now, these are not really that useful unless you're running a lot of cuts of the same type. So these options going to simply enforce certain modifiers on top of your cutters. So this one's going to be solidify. So if I'm going to run a cutter, it's going to be automatically set to solidified. I'm just going to press T and adjust it, right? This one's going to be set to mirror, so it's going to get mirrored. This one's going to be array, so you're going to be arraying the cut like this, right? It's, you know, I don't think this is very useful, to be honest. And this one is going to be bevel, so you're going to be running a beveled, you know, modifier. I don't really see a point of this because, you know, like I said, unless you're running a lot of these modifiers, you know, on multiple cuts and you're repeating the same operation, then sure. But other than that, I just prefer to run a cut, press B, and, you know, just adjust it manually. It's more precise and I have more control. And if you don't want any of these, just click on the lock and you're good to go. And obviously you got some settings here for solidification thickness. You can set the initial thickness of the solidification, mirror axis, obviously, right? And then array axis, how many iterations and how far away they're gonna be. And this one's gonna be for the size of the bevel and number of segments. Like I said, I'd never use this. And that concludes our overview of this entire menu. And like I said, this is one of two menus that you're going to be using all the time working with Boxcutter. And in next video, we're going to be talking about Shift V menu. And once we're done with this, I'm going to briefly mention some of the tools maybe on the top bar here, but things that you're never going to be using, going to be discussed in the advanced section, because there's quite a lot of options here that you may be finding useful, but definitely not useful enough to, you know, discuss them in the essential section, okay, essential tools section. So this is going to be definitely discussed in a separate section, the advanced section of Hardops and Boxcutter. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.